Hi everyone. So we'll continue discussing fallacies in this video. There's so many ways in which our psychology can work against us when it comes to seeing through an argument, to recognize if there's an actual reason to believe something. Because of the way our minds work, we can easily be fooled into feeling as if there's an actual reason to believe a conclusion, when in fact it's really a psychological sort of trick to believe something. So it'd be useful if we had some more tools that allow us to more easily recognize these sorts of mistakes in reasoning. So in this vein, we'll learn more common fallacies. So let me know if you see what's wrong here. A person says to their friend, "Do I want the police department to take charge of writing parking tickets? Do you mean, do I want to get shot if I pull up next to a fire hydrant? What do you think?" Okay, hopefully you see that the issue is about whether or not the police department should be in charge of writing parking tickets. Now, if you take a look at the reason they provide as to why they believe the police department shouldn't, the reason they provide is, do I want to get shot if I pull up next to a fire hydrant? Well, ask yourself, is that an actual reason? Does that have anything really to do with the police department being in charge of writing parking tickets? Well, not really. That's pretty far-fetched. And the issue of the police department taking charge of writing parking tickets has more to it than what's being represented here by the speaker. The speaker equates it to getting shot when you pull up next to a fire hydrant. I mean, what they're really saying is, do I want to get shot by having some sort of trivial parking infraction, right? So they've misrepresented an argument. This is what's referred to as a straw man fallacy. And along with ad hominem fallacies, the straw man is probably the most used and applied fallacy. There could be an argument, and when you are trying to convince somebody else of a different argument or a different conclusion to the argument, you just misrepresent the initial argument, make it really easy to knock down, right? That's why it's called a straw man. So the idea is speaker A gives an argument, and it's relatively, nuanced, complex. Maybe it's even a strong argument or a valid one, but you want to convince people to not believe that argument. You want to convince people that the conclusion of the original argument isn't good or isn't true. So instead, what you do is you restate the argument in much simpler terms. In fact, you sometimes distort the argument so that it becomes so frail that nobody in the right mind would come to the same conclusion, right? This is what the straw man fallacy is about. And if you pay attention to talking heads on TV, talk show news hosts, or talk show hosts for news programs, especially politicians, when they're trying to counter somebody else's argument, oftentimes what they'll do is oversimplify that argument, oversimplify it to the point that it's now a weak one, right? So they change it. They intentionally leave out premises, or they even switch the issue a little bit. So, in a way, these can be considered red herrings too, right? Because what they're doing is they're changing the argument that's being presented, and they're making it weaker so that it's much easier to knock down, and people that are listening go, "Oh, okay, that's why I should not believe that original claim," right? That original argument. So be wary of straw man fallacies. How about the following argument? Either we vote for a Democratic president or the country is going to go into the gutter. You see what's being applied here. Either we vote for a Democratic president or the country is going to go into the gutter. Well, they seem to obviously want us to vote for a Democratic president. So that's the conclusion they want us to draw. Whether or not we should vote for a Democratic president, they say, yes, you should. The reason they give is that if you don't do that, our country is going to go to the gutter. Is that really the only two options? That either vote for a Democratic president or the country is going to go into the gutter? Real life isn't usually so black and white, right? But our minds like to simplify the world, make it easier for us to make choices. So sometimes we like to assume it's an either or option in life. It's either this or that, nothing in between. This is a fallacy, right? The fallacy is called false dilemma. This is when we limit considerations to only two alternatives, although others may be available. So people often phrase their argument as an all or nothing sort of argument. Either we do it or we don't do it. Either it has to work completely 100% or we just don't do it, right? Either this has to be true or we're going to go into this place, right? There's nothing in between. There's no third option, much less 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 other alternatives, right? This is what's referred to as dualistic thinking. So human beings are often, especially in the West, we often fall prey to dualistic thinking because oftentimes logic is based upon dualistic thinking, right? Ands and ors, if you ever study programming, are a basic part of programming language. So if I said, I don't know why Barbara won't go out with me. She must think I'm too intense for her. Well, is there possibly any other reason Barbara won't go out with you other than you being too intense? Sure. You could be not very nice. You could have no sense of humor. You could be unattractive. You could be a mean person. There's lots of things, right? But to claim that's one or the other, when in fact it's not just one or the other, that's a false dilemma. And you can maybe see or recall when people frame the scenario or frame the situation as a all or nothing, this or that scenario, right? Where if you don't agree with them, then everything's going to hell. This is what's referred to as a false dilemma. There are some special types of false dilemma. One is the perfectionist fallacy, and the other is a line drawing fallacy. So the perfectionist fallacy. This is believing something is either perfect or must be rejected, right? So if I say something like, it's impossible to eliminate terrorism entirely, so we should stop wasting money on it. Well, the argument is based upon the perfectionist fallacy. Either we're perfect in our fight against terrorism or we should not fight terrorism. Hopefully it's obvious to you that that's a fallacy, that it's worthwhile to do things even though we're not going to be perfect at it. If we're not going to stop all crime, do we want to not have police? That doesn't make any sense, right? It's a perfectionist fallacy. Again, hopefully you notice that we often make choices and decisions based upon this bad logic, and we can recognize it and realize that we should think about it more thoroughly. The other type that we looked at was the line drawing. So the line drawing fallacy is believing that either there is a precise place to draw a line or there is no line to be drawn. So if we take a look at the following, there shouldn't be restrictions on violence in the movies. After all, when is a movie too violent? You can't draw a line. So the argument is trying to get us to believe that we should not have a rating system, right? That we should not have a system that tells us when something is beyond a certain level of violence. There should be no indicators for movies because there's no perfect line that delineates between when a movie is too violent, when it has too much profanity, when it's too adult. Therefore, no line should be drawn. Again, think about how that might work in the real life. Does it really make sense not to have any sort of rating system, not to have any sort of line at what age of an audience member is allowed to watch a movie just because there is no objective for sure place to put that line? Hopefully you see that that's not a very good reason to not have a rating system. That's not a very good reason to not have a line. You can think about age limits on alcohol, age limits on driving, right? There are some people who are 13 who may have the physical and psychological capabilities to drive. But a vast majority of people don't at that age. So just because there's no absolute line that can be drawn that delineates between those who can drive and those who can't, does that mean we shouldn't have an age restriction? Hopefully you see that that's not the case, right? So this is a form of the false dilemma fallacy, is that it's not either there's a clear line, or there's no line. Maybe it's not clear where the line should be, but it's still useful to have the line. That's why it's rational to believe we should have an age limit. for certain things. We should have a rating system, right? Because they give us information, because the age limits provide us with a criteria in which we can filter a majority of people from driving or taking in alcohol before they are of psychological capabilities to do that. Okay, so that's the false dilemma, special type referred to as line drawing. What's wrong with this argument? No, I don't believe in 3 strikes and you're out for convicted felons. Next thing, it'll be 2 strikes, then 1 strike. Then we will be sticking people in jail for life for misdemeanors. It's not good policy. So the issue is whether 3 strikes and you're out is a good policy. If you take a look at what the speaker's presenting to us, they don't actually give any reasons why it is not good policy, right? They don't say anything about any sort of statistics as to what happens when people are put in jail after 3 strikes and you're out. They don't say anything about what went on in terms of crime rates prior to the implementation of this policy. So they don't give any reason, right? Any evidence why this is not a good policy. Instead, they're kind of playing off of our fear by saying, hey, or our outrage, right? By saying, hey, if it's 3 strikes now, next will be 2 strikes, next will be 1 strike, and maybe after that you could be doing something really trivial and be put into jail for life. They're playing off your fear and your outrage, or they're playing off your emotions. They don't actually give you a reason why it's not good policy. This is a form of what's referred to as a slippery slope fallacy. This is when it is assumed that some event must inevitably follow from some other event. Well, if this happens, then this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and you see how bad it could get, right? When we talk about 3 strikes, we're literally talking about 3 felonies, and then you're put away in jail for life. There's nothing there inherent within 3 strikes that says it can be reduced to 2, it can be reduced to 1, it can be reduced to misdemeanors. There's nothing inherent within the 3 strikes policy that says that. So instead, the slippery slope fallacy gets us to be afraid of how bad it could be if we continually tweak the policy, right? So how bad it could be is not a good reason for, how bad it could hypothetically be is not a good reason for why it's bad policy. What's wrong with this argument? Bill says, I think that Professor Galindo has psychic powers. Jill says, no way, what's your proof? Bill says, can you prove he doesn't have psychic powers? This is a common fallacy employed in elementary school, and maybe even junior high, and in some cases even high school. Can you prove that's not true? So the issue here is whether or not Professor Galindo has psychic powers. The conclusion is to say, yes, he does. But notice that the speaker does not provide any evidence. The speaker does not provide an actual reason to believe that Professor Galindo has psychic powers. Instead, the speaker says, can you prove that he doesn't? Right? This is referred to as misplacing the burden of proof. This is when the burden of proof is placed on the wrong side of an issue, and that is presented as a reason to believe a claim. So why not? Or prove it isn't true. These are not actual reasons to believe something. Aliens landed in San Jose last month, and the person, your friend, you're speaking to goes, "What? That didn't happen." And you say, "Well, prove that it didn't." You didn't actually give them a reason why you think aliens landed in San Jose. Instead, you just imposed upon them the burden of proving that their claim is wrong, or of proving that their claim is right. So how do we know who has the burden of proof? People make claims all the time. How do we know which side has the burden to prove their particular claim? Well, a few things to take note of here. One is that we'll say that the side that has less initial plausibility has the burden of proof. So speaking of aliens, most people don't believe in aliens. There's probably less tangible proof of aliens existing. than there are of other claims about reality. So it seems on the outset to be not very plausible. So anybody making the claim that aliens exist, they would have the burden of proof. When we talk about psychic powers, for the most part, most of us don't believe in psychic abilities. The proof for psychic abilities that's in the public sphere is tenuous and limited. So then, if you're claiming somebody has psychic powers, you have the burden of proof, right? Because claiming psychic abilities for somebody is less plausible than not. Jim says, I think I got a raise today because I have an invisible good luck unicorn in my bathroom. Kate says, what? No way. Jim says, hey, can you prove that it's not true? So again, Jim is using the misplaced burden of proof. Doesn't actually give a reason for why he believes there's an invisible unicorn in his bathroom. Here, because the idea of an invisible unicorn is probably the least plausible of the options, right? Less plausible than thinking there is not one in the living room or in the bathroom. So the person that claims to have an invisible unicorn has the burden of proof. The second way in which we did, or the second reason to determine burden of proof is that if the claim that's being debated, if there's no set sense for initial plausibility, right, it can go either way, then the affirmative side is the one that has the burden of proof. The side that makes the claim, right, has the burden of proof. So Jane, high school graduates would be better off going straight to work rather than going to college. Marcia asks, why? Jane says, prove that they wouldn't be better off. Okay, so Jane, again, doesn't give a reason, right, for why she thinks high school graduates would be better off going straight to work. Instead, she uses the misplaced burden of proof. Now, if we're not too sure, right, would we be better off going straight to work rather than going to college? For something like that, where it's not maybe very clear which side is more plausible, it's the affirmative side. It's the side that makes the claim. So here, Jane is the side that makes the claim. So she has the burden of proof. And the only other scenario where this might change is, there are some special circumstances where it's decided ahead of time which side has the burden of proof. So you can think about crime. And in our country, right, you're innocent until proven guilty. So the person being accused of a crime, they don't have the burden of proof. It's the accuser that has the burden of proof, right? So sometimes there are special circumstances which determine which side has the burden of proof. Okay, a special case of the misplaced burden of proof is appeal to ignorance. So the idea here is that you should believe something because nobody has proved that it isn't true, right? So hopefully that sounds like a misplaced burden of proof. Example, Bill, I think that Professor Galindo has psychic powers. Jill, well, what is your proof? Bill, no one has been able to prove that he doesn't have psychic powers. So we're not shifting the burden of proof per se to the person you're speaking to. You're just appealing to the fact that nobody knows something. No one has been able to prove that he doesn't have psychic powers. Hopefully you realize that this is a fallacy, right? That saying nobody has been able to prove that he doesn't have psychic powers, that's not a good reason to believe that Professor Galindo has psychic powers. Okay? It's instead just appealing to our ignorance of evidence. Just because we don't have evidence to believe something doesn't mean it's not true. Yeah, it's not a reason on its own to believe a claim. Okay. What's wrong here? Somebody claims to know the Bible is true, and when pressed, well, how do you know the Bible is true? They'll say, well, because the Bible tells me. This is referred to as circular reasoning or begging the question. This is when we use premises that already assume the conclusion is true. So when somebody says the Bible is true, and if pressed, well, why do you think it's true? They say, because the Bible tells me it's true. They've already assumed that the Bible is true. Therefore, what it says, as in it says, well, what we're saying is true. That's not an actual piece of evidence to show that what it's saying is true, right? This is circular reasoning. The reason to believe something is the conclusion itself, hence circular, right? Interviewer, your resume looks impressive, but I need another reference. Bill says, Jill can give me a good reference. Interviewer goes, good, but how do I know that Jill is trustworthy? And then Bill says, that's easy. I can vouch for her. Hopefully you see it. This is also begging the question. Hopefully you see that there's circular reasoning happening here, because the reason Bill gives for Jill being a good reference is that Bill himself is believable. Bill is the reference for Jill, and Jill was supposed to be the reference for Bill. All right? Hence circular reasoning. So there's actually no evidence to show Bill is a good candidate, right? Bill's evidence is Jill, but how does the interviewer know that Jill is evidence that Bill's a good candidate? Because Bill himself vouches for her. Well, we go back to the original question. Well, how do we know we can trust Bill, right? Hence, begging the question, circular reasoning. Okay, so that whirlwind review of some more fallacies hopefully helps a little bit as you become familiar with various ways in which we are psychologically tricked into believing an argument exists when there really doesn't exist one. And in our next video, we'll take a look at maybe some practice questions to help you become more familiar with fallacies, both from Chapter 6 and from Chapter 7.